Hello and welcome to Dog Day Chess. In this episode we're going to look at some ways of creating passed pawns. I thought it would be a good idea to follow up the previous episode on pawn storms with an episode that discussed how to create passed pawns, because the two topics are somewhat related. But first let's start with some definitions. A passed pawn is a pawn that has no enemy pawns in front of it on the same file or on either of the files beside it. In other words, it can't be blockaded or captured by an enemy pawn. So in this example, white's b pawn is a passed pawn. The white pawns are moving up the screen, and the b pawn has no enemy pawns in front of it that can blockade it or capture it. White's d pawn is not a passed pawn because it can still be captured by the c pawn, and neither are the f pawn or the g pawn because the g pawn can be blockaded by the black g pawn and the white f pawn can be captured. Similarly, black has only one passed pawn, the a pawn. We also sometimes talk about candidate pawns, and a candidate pawn is a pawn that has no enemy pawns in front of it on the same file, but has enemy pawns in front of it on at least one of the files beside it. It's called a candidate pawn because it could become a passed pawn if the enemy pawns allowed it to pass them. So in this example, the white d pawn is a candidate pawn because it has no enemy pawns in front of it on the d file, but it does have an enemy pawn in front of it on an adjacent file, the c file. And here also the f pawn is a candidate pawn. Now in practice, it isn't usually the candidate pawn itself that becomes the passed pawn, but the candidate pawn is instrumental in creating a passed pawn. So we're going to start by looking at some examples of how to create a passed pawn when you have a pawn majority. For example, here white has a 2 versus 1 pawn majority, and white should be able to create a passed pawn out of this. And the rule to remember is that you should advance your candidate pawn first. So in this case, the candidate pawn is the f pawn. So if white advances the f pawn, then black really has only two options, and neither of them will stop the creation of a passed pawn. If black captures the candidate pawn, then white can capture back. Or alternatively, if black pushes his pawn, then now the f pawn is a passed pawn. Now white could create a passed pawn by advancing the g pawn first instead of the candidate pawn, but doing so would leave both black and white with passed pawns. And although in this particular position white's pawn would promote first, in other positions that might not be the case, and so it would be critical to advance the candidate pawn first. And here's another example where white has a pawn majority. It's a 3 versus 2 majority, and in this case the candidate pawn is the pawn in the middle. White's g pawn is the candidate pawn. And again, following our rule of advancing the candidate pawn first, white advances the pawn. Now if black captures back, then after exchanging the pawns, white will be left with a passed pawn. If we step back a few moves, and if instead of capturing, black pushes his h pawn, for example, then again white has a passed pawn. Now in this particular example, other moves by white will also force a passed pawn to be created. For example, if white moves not the candidate pawn but the h pawn, then if, for example, we proceed with this continuation, then white will create a passed pawn, but the problem is that black will also have a passed pawn. And so if black's pawns are closer to promotion than white's, then white will be in trouble. Let's take a look at a couple of real-life examples. In this game I'm playing white, and I'm actually down a pawn, but I do have the potential of creating an outside passed pawn on the queen side. Now I could have at this point just captured this black b pawn with my king, but that would have allowed black to get some counterplay with the rook, and I didn't want that to happen. So instead I followed the rule of candidate first, and I pushed my a pawn. In this case I pushed it 2 squares. It didn't really matter whether I pushed it 1 square or 2. Black continued simply by blockading my b pawn, and now I have an outside passed pawn, and because of that, and my king's proximity to it, I was able to promote that passed pawn and ultimately win the game. In this next example, we have a 3-on-2 situation here. Unfortunately for me, I'm playing white. So again, I advance my candidate pawn first, and after the exchange of pawns, I've got an advanced passed pawn that can't be stopped from promoting. If we rewind a little bit and have a look at what happens if black's bishop captures my pawn instead, then I will capture this pawn, and again I'll have a passed pawn, and there will be nothing black can do to prevent me from promoting. The last example we're going to look at is a classic example of a 3-on-3 face-off. Here white's pawns are closer to promotion than black's pawns, and so white is going to try to break through. And the key move for white here is to move the central pawn first. If black captures back, then white moves the f pawn, and then if black captures the f pawn, that leaves white with a passed pawn. And stepping back a little bit, if instead white captures the h pawn, then of course the f pawn can capture and white has a passed pawn again. Now notice that black also has a passed pawn, so the idea here is that you would do this type of breakthrough if your pawns are closer to promotion than your opponent's pawns. Now if we back up to the initial position, we'll see that any other pawn moved by white will allow black to prevent the breakthrough. If, for example, white were to lead with the h pawn instead of the g pawn, then black could capture the pawn, and then after a few more advances and captures, the breakthrough is prevented. So these are a few examples of how to create a passed pawn when you have a pawn majority or when you're evenly matched. As always, I hope you learned something from this episode, and thanks for watching.